Hello, church. Here we are in Ezra chapter 8, 9, and 10, finishing off yet another book of the Old Testament. Here, I want to park on two things primarily today. I want to park a little bit on prayer. There's a number of things that we can learn about prayer. Ezra is a solid man of prayer, as we can see in these chapters. And I also want to talk about holiness, because there's a great example given to us about holiness in these chapters. First of all, in regards to prayer. In chapter 8, verse 21 to 23, here we can see that Ezra humbled himself in prayer, and in humility included fasting in his prayer. That is something that you and I need to consider. Jesus assumed that people would do it in Matthew chapter 6. He gives instructions about it in the book of Isaiah, and so on. That is something that we should consider. And in fact, James chapter 4 says God promises that those who humble themselves, he will lift them up. Fasting is an aspect of that. And so it's something that you and I should consider. I also want you to see that Ezra makes a bold claim. He was actually a little afraid to ask the king for too much stuff, because he already told the king that the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him. And so it's a little bit like he's made this bold claim about prayer, but then he doesn't just walk away assuming that God will or won't. He petitions the Lord right there in prayer. And that's a great reminder for us when it comes to prayer. When somebody comes to you or I with a prayer request, what do we do with it? Whether it's a text message or whether it's in person, do we just say, yep, I'm praying for you? Or do we actually stop right there and pray with them? You can do that on text. You can send them a voice note. You can literally pray for somebody and allow them to hear it and participate together in the prayer. If you're in person, you could stop right there in the grocery store, in the gas station, or in church, or wherever at a family gathering. Imagine that. And you could just pray right there together. How awesome would that be? It's awesome. And then let me say this. This challenge I want to target at the men specifically. Look at Ezra's posture in prayer. In chapter 9, verse 5, and maybe even connected to verse 15, but specifically verse 5, he falls on his knees with his hands spread out to the Lord. Men, if you are a Christian man listening to this video, 1 Timothy chapter 2 tells us that men everywhere ought to lift up holy hands in prayer. If you just do that privately between you and the Lord, that's a great place to do it. But if you have never done that, then there's a problem. Either our posture, our physical posture, is somehow not in alignment with our hearts, or maybe our hearts are in the wrong place. Sounds tough. But when you think about all of these aspects of prayer, whether it's the posture, whether it's the humility, whether it's a bold claim that we back up with actually practicing it, maybe everybody watching, why don't you just ask the Lord this question? Lord Jesus, is there something that you would like to say to me about my current prayer life? And talk to Jesus about that. What a wonderful thing to pray about and listen to his voice for. Then in chapter 9, let's talk a little bit about holiness. In verse 10 to 12, a person should not read these two chapters thinking that God is now happy with breaking up families and marriages, okay? But what's happening here is based on a separation law that God has asked the Israelites to follow in the Old Testament. For instance, if you would see that if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 7, that when they moved into the promised land, they were not to intermarry. Out of the motivation for that is holiness, that his people would be separate. Now, the separation law no longer applies to you and I because of passages like Ephesians chapter 2, for instance, that would say the dividing wall of hostility has been removed and broken down, and that no longer applies to us. However, the call to holy living certainly still does. And you can see that if you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6, for instance, it talks about God gives this call, and it actually spills into chapter 7. God gives this call to his people to come out and be separate from these things that contaminate you. And it even says there, let us purify ourselves. And so this is not something that only God does. It is something that we participate in. In other words, if there's things in our lives that are causing us to not live a holy life, we must either make those things conform to our pattern to God's way of living. And if they don't conform, cut them out. And that's the practical application that you can see in chapter 10. Because these women that it talks about here, that are sent away, the women and children are sent away, we should not, if we look at the other stories or consider the other stories in the Old Testament, we have to remember that many people who were foreigners actually became Jews and had opportunity to do so. Just in the story that we just finished reading a few days ago in Esther chapter 8 is an example where it says many people, foreigners, were becoming Jews. And so we know they had that opportunity. We can assume that these women had the same opportunity, just like Ruth or Rahab did. Women who were foreign women, but they became Jews in order to become part of God's story, and he actually used them for great things. And so we have to remember what's happening here. It seems much more like these women have likely, the Bible doesn't say exactly, but likely these women have had that opportunity and refused it. And then, if order for God's people then to be holy, those things must be cut off. And so that needs to apply to us today. For instance, 1 Corinthians 15 talks about, verse 33 says this, bad company corrupts good character. In other words, so if there's a person in your life that will not conform to God's holy standard, you need to evangelize and talk to people about the Lord, and you can be brave to talk about it to anybody. But if there is somebody who has an influence in your life and is influencing you, and that influence is not holy and is causing you to do things that are unholy, that needs to be cut out. So do hobbies and everything else that we do. If they bring us to a place of not living holy lives for Jesus, we need to consider whether or not those things need to be cut out. And so we could ask the Lord a question based on that today and say, Lord Jesus, is there anything that you would like me to cut out of my life? Just hold that before the Lord and spend some time there with him today. Enjoy your day with Jesus.